Audio check.
Teams audio check.
Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Never thought I'd say this. Welcome to the last day of the planning inquiry. Just before we turn over to the final closing submission, just a few reminders and queries, just to get a few dates in our mind. We've got the final set of conditions from the parties, and we've also had the final CIL compliance statement, all of which is fine. Just a reminder that any party who's going to claim costs needs to do so by the end of today being 5 o'clock. We've obviously had an indication that there are going to be a couple of cost claims and maybe more, who knows, but 5 o'clock today. And then we've already set out the deadline for responses to that, which I won't go through again. Other matters that are still outstanding, we've got two obligations outstanding, the unilateral and the bilateral. Start with the bilateral obligation. Whereabouts are we on that, and what's the sort of timescale?
So we've got agreement on all of the parts that relate to the planning application. The only parts that are not yet agreed, but I should say are almost agreed, relates to the CPO. And so it's Schedule 3, and it's the provisions which would allow the council to withdraw its objection in advance of next week. There's a further amended draft that's been exchanged this morning. I very much hope that that's going to be resolved today. But I can say that at least in respect of the planning parts, if I can put it like that, yeah, the appeal parts, that's now, as of about 25 minutes ago, that's all sorted. Okay, thank you for that. And today, if it slides over into next week, a number of us are here, so we're not going to be too precious about that. Oh, I'm very grateful, so that might make all the difference, to be frank. It might be that we need until Monday, but what I will try and do is at least get you a clean copy of those parts that are agreed today, so that you can see them as up today. Yeah, good start. Thanks very much for that.
And as Mr. Henderson says, I think this is important, that is all the stuff that is material to the planning appeal. Yeah. I think that Mr. Henderson will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that some of the issues on the CPO relate to if we were to carry out the works, or if they were to carry out the works. It's the sort of the mechanics of those sorts of things, and making sure everyone understands what happens in different eventualities, which is in a sense, you know, and land and those sorts of things. You know, if they're carrying out the works, do we give them rights or licenses if we've acquired? It's that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. No,
that's correct. It's who pays for it and when do they do it. It's nothing more sophisticated than that, but sure, obviously important.
No, that's understood. That's good. Thank you. The unilateral.
So that is finalised and can be sent. I think it has its own CIL compliance document.
We've got a CIL compliance statement.
I think that relates to the 106.
Yes, I was just hesitating.
That's correct, sir. So when we amended the 106, we amended our CIL compliance statement to match it accordingly. So you don't have anything from the council by way of a CIL compliance statement for the UU.
So we will
come back on that.
We will supply that. It is complete. The only reason it hasn't been sent is, I suppose we just, you know, I think everyone was hoping that the 106 would be completed and we would just put it all in at the same time. But it's complete. It can be done. In relation to both of those documents, I mentioned earlier that I think because of needing to get people to sign, we'd be grateful if, having received the final version of the 106 on Tuesday or whenever it is, that we can then have 21 days to just make sure we get all the signatures. I suspect it'll be less than that, but you know, that just allows for people being away or on holiday or things like that. And I think that's then it, isn't it?
It is. So 21 days is agreeable from our side for
Yeah.
all those very obvious reasons in the usual way.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd add, of course, I'm sure you've seen it already, sir, tucked away at the very back of our closing submissions, you'll have seen our Appendix B, the note on the UU and our
Yeah.
submissions in respect to that. I think that was the only other thing that you'd asked for from us in respect to the UU.
Yes.
But you have that already.
Yeah, absolutely seen that. The only other matter that I've got just to pick up on was a couple of days ago raised the question of the fact that the statements of common ground are still down as drafts. And I don't think they've been particularly superseded, but we do need a final version in just for the record.
Yes.
So my instructions are that we've updated those. We've just completed that exercise and they'll be with you shortly.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, okay. And I assume when you say updated, I'm assuming that, well, obviously the word draft has been taken off, but there may be some deletions, but presumably no significant additions.
I think that's right. I think part one in particular, there's barely any change at all. And in part two, what we've done is, in the if you remember, the final column said, you know, likely to be agreed or unlikely to be agreed, and so that final column effectively has been updated.
No, that's as I was expecting it. Okay, any other housekeeping matters from anyone else? If not, let's move straight on then to the closing submissions on behalf of the appellant. Oh, yes. Looking at the size of the closing submissions, we thought we'd go for a mid-morning break rather than not being rude, but just being practical. So if you can find a convenient place to.
Sir, absolutely, I'm not going to read it all. You've set a 2-hour time limit. I will observe that, even if it means stopping mid-sentence.
Okay. Yeah, let's look for a break mid-morning.
Thank you.
Okay, over to you then.
So just before I actually start on the opening, just sort of a few housekeeping matters, almost of my own. As you'll have noticed, the closing is very long. It's some 805 paragraphs over 240 pages, plus 2 appendices. It's clearly too long to read. And so what I'm going to do over the next 2 hours is, in effect, guide you through the document. I will take you to bits. I will explain what other bits do. I will probably read some bits, but I will not be reading all of it or even very substantial parts of it. In fact, so the length of the document is not quite as daunting as it might seem. Most of the sections, it's arranged into chapters dealing with the topics. Most of the sections have some sort of introduction, a brief overview of the issues. Then they have a summary of Bowel's evidence and its assessment in the ESA, or for forecasting, you know, obviously the equivalent documents. And that's there really to sort of assist you with the location of documents where they are. It's a resource for you. That's what it's intended for. But what each section then does do, I hope, hopefully, is there's then a section that specifically identifies areas of agreement, again, with footnotes to tell you where we think things were agreed. And then, of course, importantly, an identification of the areas that remain in dispute. And those are structured on a sort of issue or thematic type basis. And what we then do for each of those is set out our position on those issues and themes and why we say you should prefer our position. And matters, of course, are also brought together in the balance, the planning balance chapter right at the end. So, as I say, it is long, but it's not quite as daunting as it may seem because there's a very, very clear structure to it. The closing will, as a generality, not cross-refer directly to points made by other parties in their closings. That would have been a huge task. What we have done, though, is certainly sought to respond to all of the issues or themes raised in other parties' closings, and we've gone through and cross-checked and to make sure that we have picked those up. We think we have, but we don't always say, this person in their closing raised this point, we respond as follows. I'll identify in a moment the overall structure of the closing and its two appendices, but I can confirm that it is supported by footnote references to the evidence. A little kind of note of caution, although the page numbers and paragraph numbers are consecutive, as I said the other day, we've forced the numbering. That has caused a few problems, but we have forced the numbering to make sure that they are. The footnotes, we couldn't, that was just, you know, that was just a task too far. And so each chapter has footnotes that restart at 1. But because obviously the footnotes are always at the bottom of the page, it's always obvious, you know, what a footnote is relating to. But I just mentioned that. Finally, I would like to thank my junior Daisy Noble for her genuinely enormous contribution to the drafting of this closing, and indeed throughout the case, and indeed to Elizabeth Tones, who's not here for once. I think she's probably on calls trying to sort out the Section 106 agreement from Womble Bond Dickinson, and the many, many others, frankly, who've worked on the closing and the obligations and the case generally. It's only right that I should acknowledge them. I sometimes think so. It's all too easy to forget that the QC is just actually the icing on the cake, and a fact I have to say that my children like to constantly remind me of. So with that by way of introduction and acknowledgement for the true debt here, I will start the closing submissions on behalf of Bristol Airport Limited. And the first chapter is an introductory chapter. I won't read all of it, but I will here unusually read some pages. So firstly, a few opening thoughts. After some 8 weeks of evidence and 6 closing submissions from other parties, now is perhaps the time to remind ourselves about what this proposed development is all about. Bristol Airport Limited, Bowel, is seeking to expand Bristol Airport to accommodate the demand to fly from, quite literally, millions of people who wish to travel, whether to go on holiday, visit family or friends, on educational or cultural exchanges, or for business. That demand is driven by local people, not just in North Somerset and the surrounding districts, but in the wider sub-regional and regional area. It's also driven by people who want to visit the local and wider area, again for a variety of reasons. People don't fly because there are airports. Rather, there are airports because people want to fly. People want to fly from Bristol Airport because it offers a good quality of service, a range and frequency of destinations that people find attractive. Bristol Airport is successful because it is good at meeting customer demand. The level of that demand has had to be reforecast in the context of the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, but there is broad agreement between Bowel and North Somerset Council on the level and timing of forecast growth. In catering for such demand, the airport is able to provide jobs and income for those that are actually employed at the airport, but also generate jobs and economic opportunities for many, many others. Many in the local business community have spoken up in support of expansion. Arguments that jobs and opportunities should be deliberately foregone in the hope that they will, in part at least, be displaced to other, even more needy areas of the country is, frankly, the mantra of despair. The policy objective is to level up, not level down to some lowest common denominator. As for adverse effect, Bowel has always acknowledged that there are adverse effects, but what must also be acknowledged is that Bristol Airport's rural location makes many of those adverse effects relatively modest. It is genuinely difficult to think of any large development that has no impacts, and that is certainly true of infrastructure development. That is why, however, the planning system allows a planning balance to be undertaken between what are often very local impacts against what are often much wider benefits. In that context, however, Bowel has undertaken a detailed environmental impact assessment in its environmental statement and then updated this, where appropriate, in its environmental statement addendum to understand the likely significant effects of the proposed development. Indeed, it is interesting to note that there has been very little, if any, challenge to the actual environmental effects reported in the ES and the ESA. The challenge has largely been to the interpretation of those results. And that is actually quite remarkable when you think about it. Properly understood, Bowel has demonstrated that the adverse effects are not significant in the context of environmental impact assessment. Indeed, in terms of health, there are assessed to be public health benefits of the proposed development. Bowel has also sought to engage constructively with the local planning authority on mitigation. Indeed, before refusal, it had agreed all mitigation with officers in a series of conditions and Section 106 heads of terms. In negotiations during the inquiry itself, Bowel has genuinely tried to find a middle way and has enhanced its mitigation offer where it has felt that that is appropriate. Of course, there have been many other important issues in this inquiry, including climate change, greenbelt and highways, and these are all considered below. It is important to note, however, that at its heart, the application is seeking to meet an acknowledged demand from millions of people to fly each year, and it is doing so by making best use of the existing runway infrastructure at Bristol Airport in a way that maximizes its benefits and appropriately mitigates its adverse environmental effects. What these closing submissions will try to do is to identify and consider the various substantive arguments debated during the inquiry in a fair and balanced way. They are firmly grounded in the written and oral evidence and fully referenced in detailed footnotes throughout. And we hope that they will help you to find a way through that evidence. The broad structure of Bowel's closing is as follows. Chapter 1, this chapter is the introductory section. Then there's a section on forecasting. Chapter 3 is socioeconomics. Chapter 4, noise. Chapter 5, air quality. Chapter 6, health. Chapter 7, surface access and parking. Chapter 8, climate change. Chapter 9, greenbelt. Chapter 10, other matters. These are matters principally raised by third parties, Rule 6 parties, sorry. And Chapter 11, the planning balance. There is also an Appendix 1 that picks up various legal points raised by others and we set out Bowel's position. This appendix is sometimes referred to in the text related to the issue to which it relates, but not always so. So in other words, sometimes, just frankly because of a lot of the legal submissions come in at the end, we haven't always dropped things in the appropriate chapter, but we have tried to pick up all those legal issues. So sometimes we cross-refer, sometimes not. Appendix 2 to this closing provides Bowel's commentary on its Section 106 agreement with NSC and its unilateral undertaking. This appendix is intended to assist the inspectors in understanding how these documents work and the relationships between them. My second subheading, an unusual inquiry in many ways. This has been an unusual inquiry in many ways. It has been the first major blended planning inquiry following the changes to procedure required during the pandemic. It has been an unusually long inquiry by recent standards, and it has involved a lot of parties, the applicant, the local planning authority, and no less than 5 Rule 6 parties. But it has been unusual in other respects too. There have been some pretty direct attempts to attack the merits of government policy through the back door by challenging weight. Parties have sought to debate the UK's strategy for achieving its carbon budget and net zero target in 2050. There have been efforts to discredit a government consultation on its strategy for achieving net zero aviation. matters agreed between the applicant and officers have become unagreed and the subject of fierce debate. Rather than defining the local planning authority's case, its reasons for refusal have become little more than a loose framework to be departed from at will. New issues have been raised and new legal objections identified. Indeed, it is now said that to grant planning permission for this, presumably any other form of development that is not itself net zero, would be contrary to the duties of the Secretary of State in sections 1 and 4 of the Climate Change Act, and therefore unlawful. It is asserted that a single elasticity variable in a consultant's model is so important that failure by the consultant to disclose it renders large areas of the evidence of little or no weight. Yes, this has been an unusual inquiry. But the objective in Bowel's closing submissions is to try to assist the inspectors to find their way through all these matters in order to get to the substance of the evidence and to genuinely grapple with the underlying merits in the context of the legal and policy framework that applies to decision-making under the Town and Country Planning Act. My next heading, a glimpse behind the curtain. In its speaking note to NSE's closing submissions, NSE sought to characterize Bristol Airport Limited as having, quote, pursued its own interests ahead of sustainable development, of being, quote, convinced of its own self-importance, of being, quote, self-involved, so self-involved that it cannot even contemplate another view, of exhibiting, quote, closed-mindedness, and being, quote, lacking in appreciation and, quote, focused on profit, and so lacking in appreciation focused on profit that it pursues growth ahead of mitigation, and putting, quote, the pursuit of profit before the well-being of people and its operations affect. Nothing, of course, could be further from the truth. Bristol Airport is a regional airport that is very much grounded in its local and wider communities where most of its employees actually live. It is absolutely focused on sharing the benefits of growth and appropriately mitigating its effects, and it hopes that its evidence and conduct throughout this inquiry has made that clear. These unfair allegations are therefore firmly rejected. What they reveal about the Council, however, is rather more interesting. NSE's closing submissions are made on behalf of the Council. As has been stressed more than once, that means its members. And such serious allegations against an applicant can only have been made on instruction. What those allegations reveal, therefore, that Council members are not only hostile to the application, but hostile to the applicant itself. Maybe this glimpse behind the curtain will assist the inspectors in understanding how members came to reject the clear professional advice of their officers on the benefits and limited likely significant effects of the proposed development, and those officers' conclusions that the application was compliant with policy and should be granted planning permission. Now, at this point, I'm going to break away from reading text for a bit. As I said before, we've tried to set out things that we just thought would be useful to you as inspectors writing your reports and sort of gather things together. So we've set out a section on the description of the development. I don't need to read that. We've then, from page 6 onwards, there are several paragraphs that I don't need to go through on, you've heard it many times before, the pre-application process, the officer's report, the committee's determination of the application, and by page 11, we simply identify the issues that you identified in the first case management conference. On page 12, there's a heading there that I'll just touch on, legal and policy context, and this is where I just remind you that, look, a number of legal points have been raised. Our Appendix 1 deals with them on a thematic approach. Those 5 themes, very broadly, are ecology and the application of habitat regulations. This particularly relates to PCAA's legal submissions. Matters relating to the impact of the proposed development on climate change, many of those really are ban CC points. Approach to assessing harm to the greenbelt, detailed design of the proposed A38 highway improvements, and matters of fairness, which are principally NSC points. So, Chapter 2, forecasting. Here, the introduction sort of sets out what this chapter is about. There's a brief description of paragraph 31 of the principal areas of dispute, and then quite a long section that tries to draw together some of the policy context within which the forecasting takes place. You will see, for example, from paragraph 41 on page 16, we touch there on MBU and weight. And I'm not going to read these sections. MBU and the weight to be attached to MBU, as you can imagine, for obvious reasons, is a bit like a sort of thread that runs through a lot of this. It arose during forecasting, it arose during climate change, it arose during planning balance, and we've tried to pick it up in the places that arose, but I'm not going to repeat things, but there is a theme there. I might read some of our sections on this later. On page 19, there's a section on wider context, which is relevant in particularly the forecasting section, which talks about the wider drivers to air traffic demand, and I don't need to go about that. And then there's a section from page 23 on various impacts on the forecast, Brexit and COVID-19 being important ones. Page 24 talks about, this is the section that sort of in a sense summarizes for you where the evidence is. Things that were agreed during cross-examination are often noted in the footnotes. And from page 82, you can see sections on, and these are actually quite important, the forecasting inputs to the environmental statement, because, as I can remember saying at an earlier stage in this inquiry, for the environmental statement, it's not really just an input of 12 Mppa. That's not relevant. It's what's the pattern during the day, of people arriving at the airport. That's important for junctions. You need to know, are they arriving in the AM and PM peak or the interpeak and things like that. And so all of those things that you can see on page 83 are the, if you like, the sub-forecast. They're the things that come out of the headline that actually drive the environmental effect.
Do you mean paragraph 83 or page 83?
Yeah, I mean paragraph 83.
I thought you did, but just to clarify.
Thank you. This inquiry being on YouTube has revealed my, or at least some of my many failings, numbers being some of them, but now even words. It's downhill all the way, I think. So the 7 outputs that are really particularly relevant there. And paragraph 85, maybe I'll just pick up and read a little bit of this now. What we've identified in paragraph 85 is what we think are the areas of agreement, or that have become areas of agreement. As noted above, there are a significant number of areas of agreement between the Council and Bowel, and these are as follows. There is no dispute that the forecasting methodology adopted by York Aviation is appropriate and absolutely standard. There is no challenge by NSC to the use of a Monte Carlo analysis within the econometric model. The modelling of alternative growth scenarios is agreed to be a sensible one, and there is no dispute about the faster and slower growth scenarios examined. There remains agreement at the that the core case, which would see the airport reach 12 Mppa in 2030, is most likely to materialize. It is agreed that at this point in time, the faster growth case is less likely to be materialized than either the core or slower growth cases. It is agreed that there is a strong correlation between the levels of air noise, impact on air quality, and carbon emission from aircraft types. New generation aircraft are increasingly both cleaner and quieter than current generation. Mr. Foley recognizes that short-term forecasts are not used to derive the inputs for the environmental assessment of the proposed development. These are areas of agreement, and these areas far outweigh the remaining areas of dispute. So the outstanding issues in dispute, the thrust of NSE's case is that there is a significant degree of uncertainty regarding the forecasts. And there are two particular factors that give rise to this. Firstly, the implications of Jet2's announcement that it would commence operations from Bristol Airport, introducing uncertainty around the assumptions regarding the busy day timetable and fleet mix, and B, the assumptions around the rate of recovery of business travel, which has particular implications for the socioeconomic analysis. And what you'll then see from paragraph 90 onwards, we here consider the effects of the Jet2 announcement. And you can see, for example, at paragraph 98, we record there for you that you actually asked our noise expert, Mr. Williams, and our air quality expert, Mr. Pierce, to produce notes saying, look, what would be the effects on their particular disciplines of the different fleet mixes. And actually, it turns out that they don't make all that much difference. You can read the notes, and I'm not going to try and sort of completely summarize them, but you can see the reference there to INQ 30 and 31. You can read them obviously for yourselves. Page 33 is the section on business travel, and as I say, there's obviously a correlation here between the things that were said during the forecasting topic and the things that were said during the socioeconomic topic. And again, we go through the various points that were raised about use of DFT elasticities and projections forward from particular years. Paragraph 112, for example, there were the points about whether you include the low-cost bubble years and whether that was appropriate and so on. And we summarize all of that evidence. On page 36, we've briefly, but I hope not unfairly, just touched on some of the things raised by Rule 6 parties on forecasting. And on page 37, we draw some key conclusions. And then we get to chapter 3 on page 39, which is the socioeconomic chapter. And I'll just read a couple of paragraphs at the beginning here, paragraph 109 and 110. Whilst there remain a number of areas of disagreement between NSC and Bowel, two of the most fundamental aspects of Bowel's case are now broadly agreed. The level of employment that the proposed development will deliver in terms of direct, indirect, and induced employment figures, in addition to that resulting from inbound tourism, and the contribution of the proposed development in GVA in terms of direct, indirect, and induced, in addition to that resulting from inbound tourism. The principal areas that are not agreed concern the assumption of growth in business travel, as I mentioned before, on the question of displacement, the impact of outbound tourism, and the matters to do with the scope of any cost benefit analysis. So we then get, again, following this sort of general structure that we've tried to adopt, tried to draw together for your benefit the sort of relevant policy things and references to where you'll find all of that at a national, regional, and local level. And on page 44, conclusions, we draw 6 major themes from policy. First, that airports are a national asset and their expansion is a core part of boosting global connectivity, which is essential to the vision of global Britain. B, there is clear government support for airport expansion, subject to local environmental effects being acceptable. C, such airport expansion drives the whole economy and supports the levelling up agenda. D, MBU continues to be government policy and is to be given full effect in decision making. E, airport expansion outside the southeast in particular contributes to levelling up at the regions. And F, one of the 3 pillars of building back economic recovery and levelling up is investment in high quality infrastructure. And this is crucial for economic growth, boosting productivity and competitiveness. And then again, we have a section on some of the wider themes. And from page 46, we again pull together, I hope helpfully, our assessment of the socioeconomic effects, what they are, the benefits, where you will find that evidence. And as you can see, for example, on page 46, pretty full sets of footnotes, including to some of the individual parties that turned up from organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and so on. Page 49, we summarize the position of the Council's own officers, and on page 50, we have the areas of agreement, which I've touched on, and the outstanding issues in dispute, which maybe I'll just identify here, because this is the structure then for this bit. There remain 4 main areas of disagreement between Bowel and NSC, and these are as follows. Productivity benefits resulting from the growth in business travel, the extent of displacement of economic benefits associated with the proposed development, C, the impact of outbound tourism, and D, the scope of the cost-benefit analysis. And what we have then done is summarize our arguments and in relation to each of those. So on page 51, we deal with business travel and productivity benefits. 163 is the start of the section on displacement. I'll just read 1 or 2 paragraphs here to just give you a flavor of what we're covering. So paragraph 163, displacement is the concept of economic activity in one location, taking or moving economic activity away from somewhere else or some other economic activity. In other words, it's the idea that if economic activity does not happen in one location or in another sector, it will merely happen elsewhere. As explained by Mr. Brass, there is a significant degree of difficulty and uncertainty associated with displacement. As Mrs. Ciro acknowledged, there is no standard method for calculation of displacement. That's actually quite an important concession, particularly in the context of the debate about the lambda value and things of that sort. It is inevitable that the scale of displacement will depend on the area over which you examine the effects. Indeed, the primary relevance of displacement is to public sector interventions which seek to improve the way a market functions. In these instances, it is necessary to understand the full impact of any particular intervention. By contrast, the proposed development is a private sector investment that is responding to market signals. Anyway, I then go on and deal there with various things. If I just pick up paragraph 168, just some of the points about the logic model and all of these sorts of things, and they're also covered elsewhere. But NSC argues that in order to understand how the passenger allocation logic model works, it's necessary for Mr. Ciro to have access to the lambda value within York Aviation's model, and that in the absence of understanding the lambda value used and its justification, Jacobs is unable to advise the Council that the passenger allocation model utilized by York Aviation is robust, and that Jacobs has been unable to scrutinize the model. Mr. Brass does not accept this characterization of the issue and has specifically responded to the points made by Mr. Ciro about his ability to scrutinize the model. And, for the reasons set out, he considers that it is clear that Jacobs could have scrutinized the logic model, but it has simply not done so. The issue of the lambda value formed no part of the members' reasons for refusal, nor indeed is it in NSC's statement of case. It is an issue that has been created as part of a wider strategy of setting up artificial tests or requests for information that Bowel has not complied with or cannot comply with, in order to say that less weight should be placed on its evidence, or that to take that evidence into account would create legal risk. And you'll have seen numerous references to errors of law and challenges and all of this sort of stuff. The plain fact is that Jacobs is a major airport and socio-economic consultancy that could have, and indeed did, produce its own evidence on displacement. NSC has had over a year from the date of the appeal to ask Jacobs to update its previous displacement report and has simply failed to do so. I then set out how the officers characterize all of this, and then pick up at 171. The irony of all this is that it is Mr. Ciro himself who relies on displacement to argue that the economic benefits of the development are in effect offset by a loss of potential economic benefits elsewhere. It was never a central theme of Bowell's evidence. Bowell's response to Mr. Ciro's arguments on displacement are broadly as follows. York Aviation has carried out an assessment of displacement which shows that its effects would be limited. This position was agreed with NSC officers and Jacobs' own assessment that was not that different. There is no policy that the airport should not expand so that the economic activity that would be generated goes to another location, for example, Cardiff. This is the case whether or not those other locations are areas of deprivation. The proposed development will deliver real benefits to local communities in North Somerset. This includes two areas of deprivation which fall within the labour market for the airport, both Weston-super-Mare and South Bristol. These should not be discounted on the basis that were the expansion not to occur, these jobs would simply be delivered elsewhere. Such an approach has no basis in policy, evidence, or logic. Indeed, taken to its logical conclusion, the generation of employment or GVA by any development could be discounted on the basis that if it did not occur in that location, it would merely occur somewhere else. This was acknowledged by Mr. Ciro. With population in the area expected to grow rapidly, there will be a need to generate a significant number of new jobs. It is simply not appropriate or safe to assume that these will simply appear elsewhere, I think that should be, as Mr. Ciro has done. The proposed development would provide only a small proportion of the jobs required in the future. Standing back, it is surprising that the Council is pursuing such a line of argument. In effect, they are seeking to discount the very real local benefits in North Somerset on the basis that if the growth did not occur here, it would occur elsewhere in any event. The creation of jobs in Cardiff, Birmingham, or Heathrow, leaving aside whether or not they would in fact occur, are of no value to the people of North Somerset. Furthermore, Mr. Serio's whole argument runs contrary to NSE's own approach to the generation of local jobs through the developments such as Junction 21 enterprise area. I mean, if this was a logical argument, then you wouldn't provide jobs there. You just wouldn't matter because they could go to Leamington Spa or Hartlepool or somewhere else. The real position is that potential displacement of economic activity to other areas if Bristol Airport did not expand does nothing to assist the very real economic needs of the local communities around the airport, a theme that NSE seems keen to emphasize in relation to sharing the benefits. And the agreed employment, GVA, and other socio-economic benefits should be given, of course, considerable weight. I then turn to outbound tourism. Don't need to read that. Cost-benefit analyses. And on page 60, I touch on the Rule 6 parties. And I put there, I do apologize, Mr. Chapman. I think it's in fact Dr. Chapman, isn't it? Is my recollection. Apologies, that's my fault. I think you will need to just correct that. I'm pretty certain it was Dr. Chapman, and I'm sorry about that. No disrespect to him, obviously. Then I get to chapter 4, noise, on page 62. Again, maybe if I just sort of scope of the dispute, paragraph 195, the main point of contention between Bowel and NSC concerns the evaluation of the air noise results. There's no dispute about the production of the noise contours or the numerical results drawn from them. The dispute concerns inter alia, the use of, sorry, this is kind of, why do lawyers use Latin? I don't know. The dispute that includes, that's me again, amongst other things, the use of the LAQT as a primary metric, the role of supplementary metrics within the assessment, and the indicators of significance for night noise. There are also issues about the adequacy of mitigation. The dispute concerning ground noise relates to the adequacy of the assessment carried out and the extent to which the LAQT captures all aspects of the noise impact. And with regards to road traffic noise, there's no dispute that the impact of the proposed development would not be significant. It is fair to say in this context that Bowel does not accept NSC's summary of the evidence on air noise effect in its closing submissions, and considers that NSC has mischaracterized the significance of the air noise effects. Bowel will set out its own summary of that position below, but the suggestion that hundreds or indeed thousands of residents will experience significant adverse effects as a result of the proposed development is simply wrong, especially in the context where the results of the air noise assessment as reported in the ESA are not challenged. I then set out again the policy context. I don't think I need to take you through that orally, perhaps on page 69. What I've done here, and I won't read it all out, there's lots and lots of numbers. What we've set out here for you are the results of the updated air noise assessment for the LAQT metric and what the numbers actually are in the ESA, and we've pointed you to where the contours are. Slightly surprisingly, during the inquiry, we spent very little time actually looking at the contours, looked at all sorts of numbers, but you do see there, when you look actually at the with and without contours, that actually the differences between them in the with and without case in the future are really, as I've said before, relatively modest. You know, they don't hugely increase when you look at them. And on page 70, again, this kind of really is important because it goes to this point about significance, which I'll return to in a minute. But what is important to look at is the changes in the noise levels as a result of the development. It's my, Western-super-Mare beach analogy with the contours being very, very shallow, so that actually it's only very small differences in the amount of noise seem to push the contours out. You suddenly get large numbers of additional dwellings or areas in relative terms, but the actual difference in noise between the two really are pretty small, and so we've set those out therefore, and there's no disagreement that those are the results. There is absolutely no debate about that at all. Page 71, right at the bottom, we identify there the areas of agreement. And there are actually an awful lot of areas of agreement. We identify paragraph 227 in particular, 9 main points that are now agreed. I don't need to read those, but also in 228 and 229 and 230, points of agreement on the other aspects, which we haven't really touched on very much, of ground noise, road traffic noise, and construction noise. So page 73, we get to the outstanding issues in dispute, and for air noise there are 7 main ones. Fleet mix, the role of different metrics in assessing air noise impacts, the appropriateness of the indicators of significance. That's important. That really is important. In that context, the evaluation of the daytime impacts and then the nighttime impacts, impact of the development on non-residential receptors, and then appropriate conditions and obligations. And so I've sort of started there with fleet mix, and then over the page 74 with metrics, and you can relive the delights of N70 and SELs and LAE maxes and everything else. It's all captured for you. Page 77, I will read this if you will bear with me, the point on the indicators of significance, because in a sense this drives down into the heart of the dispute. Our characterization is that Mr. Fumicelli and the Council's evidence just talks about numbers of dwellings and numbers of people or areas within certain contours. What matters is what difference does the development make? Is this a likely significant effect? So the approach to EIA significance adopted in the ES and the ESA has regard to both the absolute noise level and the change in noise level. The ES and the ESA adopted Lowell and Sol thresholds to consider first the absolute noise level forecast in the modelling. Set out above, the absolute thresholds adopted for the daytime are agreed. With regard to the change in noise levels, the threshold of significance adopted was 3 dB for receptors with absolute levels between Lowell and Sol, and 2 dB for receptors above Sol. The lower threshold of change above Sol reflects evidence that people are more sensitive to increases in noise at higher absolute levels. So we've acknowledged that and we've taken that into account. The absolute values for nighttime Lowell and Sol remain in dispute. The ESA has adopted values of 45 and 55 dB for nighttime Lowell and Sol. Mr. Fumicelli's position appears to be nighttime Sol should be 50 and the nighttime Lowell 40, which he says is informed by the airport's rural location. What I then set out in paragraph 244 is why we believe, in detail, Mr. Fumicelli is simply wrong on this and that we are right. I don't need to read the points out, but we say there are very clear reasons why Mr. Fumicelli is wrong on that, and we're not aware of any examples of other airports or other inquiries where his basis has been adopted. 246, paragraph 246, with regard to the level of change threshold, so this is to understand EIA significance, the approach adopted in the ES and the ESA represents a conventional but conservative approach. Mr. Fumicelli agrees that a 3 dB change has conventionally been used as the minimum perceptible under normal conditions. The APF identifies 3 dB as the level of change at which acoustic insulation should be provided. Aviation 2050 identifies 3 dB as the new minimum level of change above 54 dB, LAQ 16, to be used as an eligibility criterion for assistance with noise insulation. The IEMA guidelines identifying a change of less than 2.9 dB as non-existent. And this level of change is consistent with the approach accepted at the recent Stansted appeal decision and the Heathrow-Cranford agreement decision, in which 3 dB was contested, but insufficient evidence was found to depart from it. Importantly, Mr. Fumicelli confirmed in cross-examination that in considering the significance of air noise effects, he was not proposing any alternative change criteria to the 3 dB below Seoul and 2 dB above Lowell, I think that should be, sorry, adopted in the ESA by Bowel. There are therefore no alternative change criteria advanced by NSC on which the inspectors can consider the EIA significance of the air noise effects of the proposed development. Then the evaluation of the daytime impacts. The results of the daytime assessment are set out in detail in the ESA. And then I've set them out there as sort of commentary on what those are. You can read those. 249, for example, with regards to the number of people highly annoyed, the ESA shows that there is a reduction in people in 2030 compared with the 2017 baseline. Once again, not surprisingly, the number is higher in the 2030 case with development than without the development. That's obviously because there are more movements at that 2030 date in the future. With regard to the updated N70 results in Mr. Williams' rebuttal proof, the following 3 points need to be borne in mind when assessing their significance. The N70 defines the area exposed to the number of events of 70 dB or greater, but this threshold of 70 dB has no particular significance within the UK. It is simply a number. It represents an external exposure level which results in an event of approximately 60 dB experienced internally with windows fully open, 55 dB with windows half open, 45 with windows closed, and 30 to 40 with noise insulation. It is agreed that 60 dB represents the level of speech interference when experienced indoors, and as such, only with fully windows open would an N70 event result in this impact. This is in the context, as I think was agreed, that 60 dB is about the level of the human voice at a meter. So something that's above 60 would be about the same level as the human voice at a meter. The N70 metric is insensitive to the scale of any change in noise level. An imperceptible change can result in a large increase in the number of events over the selected threshold. Indeed, all the increases seen in the N70 results are a consequence of changes that are less than 1 dB. The ICANN report found that there was some limited evidence linking N70 to annoyance and no evidence to link it to a health issue, whilst NX was considered the most appropriate complementary metric. Further work is needed on defining the appropriate N value, as they said. The SONAR report concluded that N70 and LAQ generally represent the same thing, but that LAQ is the most appropriate metric when dealing with when results diverge. The ESA concluded that the proposed development would give rise to no significant adverse daytime noise effects. The main point of criticism of this assessment in Mr. Fumicelli's proof concerns the failure to evaluate N70. For the reasons set out above, the N70 results were considered, but do not alter the conclusions that there are no significant effects. And I then go through the same exercise for nighttime and look at the effects there. Perhaps at paragraph 256, it's just worth very briefly picking up the story, because this is the point about awakenings. Mr. Fumicelli further argues that the likelihood of additional awakenings has not been properly assessed. Bowel's response is as follows. It is agreed that there is no policy requirement to assess awakenings, nor is there any requirement to do so in accordance with good practice. Awakenings for these purposes is a technical term, which includes within its scope changes in sleep state that an individual would not be conscious of occurring. It is agreed that it is perfectly normal for individuals to experience several of these a night. Indeed, Mr. Fumicelli's evidence is that, on average, individuals experience 24 awakenings a night, quite independently of noise effects. This is reflected in the WHO Community Noise Guidelines, which identified that 80 to 90% of reported cases of sleep disturbance in noisy environments are caused by reasons other than noise. Whilst Mr. Fumicelli relies heavily on the Basner method to assess additional awakenings, this method is not recommended for use by the WHO. Indeed, the WHO characterizes the relationship between single event noise indicators and long-term health outcomes as tentative. In any event, Mr. Williams presented an awakenings assessment in his proof of evidence, which demonstrates that only one location would pass the Basner threshold of one additional awakening per night, and it would do so in both the 10 Mppa and the 12 Mppa case. Tables 8, 9, and 10 presented in Mr. Fumicelli's evidence, setting out awakenings per week for the 10 Mppa and 12 Mppa scenarios, are not based on actual locations. They do not, therefore, purport to provide an alternative assessment of awakenings to be used in the determination of the appeal. They were, in effect, just illustrations of how the methodology worked. So the overall conclusion, as you can see, in fact, is that there are no significant changes in respect of nighttime air noise impacts. The rest of the chapter then looks at ground noise, and it touches on page 68 on conditions and obligations. In relation to the section there that starts at paragraph 268 on air noise conditions, I've outlined what they are there, but I just pick up the point of paragraph 266 because this drives back into policy and NPSC. These measures are proposed in order to mitigate and minimize the impact of air noise effects that arise above the Lowell, in accordance with the guidance in NPSC. This is supplemented by the obligations set out below. So there's this point that between the Lowell and the Seoul, you're still supposed to mitigate and minimize, but that doesn't need to be noise insulation, and that's very clear. These noise conditions and the controls are intended to be that mitigation. Then the proposed obligations, and again, we set out there our position, and it's worth just reading the last part of 268. In respect of night noise, the noise insulation scheme will contribute significantly to mitigating the effects for all of the 250 dwellings above Seoul at night time, and some that are actually below the Seoul but above the Lowell. So all of those above the Seoul, many of them, of course, will already have noise insulation, but they are all within the scheme where they will be offered noise insulation. The ATM limit, this was the suggestion that there should be an ATM limit, we deal with that, and the role of slot coordination. Paragraph 275, I just pick up the point, it's quite wrong for NSC to imply that the airport is unable to control its growth without full slot coordination. The airlines at the airport operate under normal commercial contracts, and it is up to Bowel to decide when it wishes to release additional capacity. It doesn't have to release capacity. Airlines have to contract for slots and capacity. Clearly, it will make that decision, as it always has, having regard to the planning conditions imposed upon it. And of course, you know, the point was made during the evidence. Bowel has actually operated with an air noise cap perfectly satisfactory for many, many years without full slot coordination. Now, the fact is, it does, as it becomes congested, it will want to have full slot coordination that is of assistance to the airport, but it's simply not right that that is necessary. We have offered a condition on this, and we hope that that gives you some sort of reassurance that, you know, it is our intention to apply, but obviously it's ultimately a matter for the Secretary of State. Chapter 5 is air quality. What I think I might do is take this chapter and then perhaps health fairly quickly, and then that might be a moment to pause. Would that be acceptable? So air quality, same format, setting out the areas of dispute, summarizing our assessment, page 99, or 89 and 99. 89 identifies the areas of agreement, and there are actually quite a lot of them, to be frank. The issues only came down to two, really: the assessment of ultrafine particles and the evaluation of the modeling results. There's a sort of kind of third point that I mention at paragraph 317, which is non-threshold air quality effects, but we've dealt with that in the health chapter, so I don't need to go to it here. We've set out here, you can see from 318 onwards, our position on ultrafine particles, what our evaluation showed, and indeed on the evaluation of the results. I mean, it is actually pretty important. If you will recall, the Dr. Broomfield did accept that none of the effects were significant in EIA terms, and that clearly is important. Health starts on page 103. We start by making this point right at the beginning, paragraph 331, that we are here dealing with public health, which means an approach that focuses on health at a population level, not an individual level. This is not a clinical health issue. This is, in planning, a public health issue. And again, we set out our assessment and the methodology, the position with officers, and at page 110, we identify points of dispute. There isn't a section here on areas of agreement, because there was no sort of, no other witness that was dealing with health, insofar as inputs to health are air noise, air quality, and socioeconomics, and areas of agreement have been dealt with in those chapters. So that's why there isn't a separate heading here. But there are three remaining points of dispute raised by NSE in its noise and air quality evidence. The first of these is the impact of air noise effects of the proposed development on cardiovascular health outcomes of the local population, B, the impact of non-threshold effects from air pollutants, and C, the assessment of interrelated and or in combination health effects. And in relation to the first of those, cardiovascular impacts, we summarize there the evidence in this dispute, but when you get to paragraph 364, it says very clearly that taking account of the contextual evidence and the range of quantitative measures provided by the ES noise chapter, it's clear that a significant adverse population health effect would not be expected from the proposed development, and the evidence is absolutely clear on that, and there is no other public health expert. Non-threshold air quality effects. I think the important thing here, obviously there was this very late WHO document that came in and that everyone commented on, and I set out at paragraph 369 one of the passages from Mr. Pearce's note on that, and I'll kind of just read it and then the two lines that follow. The HIA methodology also takes account of local health priorities, baseline conditions, regulatory standards, health policy context, and consultation responses. Even with the new WHO position providing scientific evidence for lower levels at which health effects occur from certain air quality pollutants, this does not change the HIA assessment. The HIA has already taken non-threshold effects into account. By definition, this is all the way down to zero, i.e. no lower threshold. This is lower than the new WHO guidelines. The HIA also place such small changes in risk factors into the context of other evidence sources and the UK regulatory regime. Having consulted with Mr. Piper on the issue of the new guidelines, he confirms that the HIA conclusions are not changed by the new WHO guideline values. It's important to understand, therefore, that the method adopted in the HIA that already looks at non-threshold effects down to zero is not changed by the new WHO guidelines. And then there's a section on interrelated and in combination effects. And I wondered if that was, I think I've been going now for how long have I been going? About an hour, because we obviously had a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning. Is that an opportunity to pause?
Yep, I think that's a useful break. Let's come back at past, please. Right. Onwards then, Mr. Humphreys.
Sound like Santa's reindeer. I will go onwards. Chapter 7's page 115 is transport. Paragraph 377, I'll just touch on these 4 preliminary points about the scope of the reasons for refusal. Nowhere is there any objection in the reason for refusal to the proposed development based on a lack of a travel plan, nor is the development plan policy that relates to travel plans referred to in the reason for refusal, even though there has been evidence on that. Nor do they contain any allegation of gaps or issues with the highway modelling. There's nothing in the reason for refusal that contains any criticism of the design of the A38 works. And in fact, the reasons for refusal disclose no technical highway objections at all. This is important because as the scope of NSE's evidence during the course of the inquiry has substantially departed from the scope of the wording of the original reasons for refusal, this has raised matters that simply did not form part of the committee's objection to the proposed development. And so just at the top of the next page, 380, sort of, I think, I found the most depressing paragraph. Somewhat unusually, by the close of the evidence, the scope of dispute between Bowel and NSE is actually greater than it first appeared from the reasons for refusal. Mr. Collis's proof of evidence makes 6 technical concerns about the A38 improvement works, in addition to a number of complaints about the provision of information relating to the design. This is surprising given that the design of these works was produced in collaboration with the council itself and agreed with officers before the determination of Bowel's application. In respect of the methodology and results of the highway modelling, Mr. Coles's proof of evidence identifies 6 main issues, and by the close of evidence, 4 of these remain, and I'll come on and touch on those in a minute. So we've set out there, as we've done in previous cases, a section on the policy context to try to assist you to what we say on all the policies, a little bit on the wider context from the bottom of page 18, top of page 19, pre-application discussions, and then from page 120, our transport assessment, and then from page 122, 123 onwards, there's quite a lot of detail about what the assessment actually shows, and I certainly don't need to read any of that. Page 125 deals with our assessment of the appropriate public transport mode share, and drawn a lot of the evidence there. 126 is our assessment of car parking. Deal with the various points there, conclusions. Page 129, the position of officers, and then page 130, paragraph 421, we get to the areas of agreement. The following issues are now agreed. It's not a lot, unfortunately, but you can see what the things are that are agreed, but then there's a list of outstanding issues in dispute, and unfortunately that's rather longer, and much of it is to do with technical issues, to do with design and so on. So we've tried to break them down into these groups. 424 general issues about junction modelling, and then 425 specific issues about the A38 improvement works, and you can see under each of those headings what the outstanding issues are, and then you can see from page 131 onwards, we break those down, I hope helpfully again, into the individual issues and try and set out our position. So I don't think I need to read through any of that. From page 134, we come to the A38 improvement works, our position on each of those things, and then page 139 we get the outstanding issues in dispute in respect of public transport mode share, and the two issues seem to be adequacy of the evidence and whether the target is sufficiently ambitious. We deal with that. Over the page 140, outstanding issues in respect of car parking, and again there are 5 matters that are identified as still being in dispute. I don't think I need to read any of those. We deal with the proposed conditions on page 144 and key conclusions on 145, and that brings me then to chapter 8, carbon and climate change. And there are a number of issues on this topic, so which has been of relevant to the cases of a number of the objectors, and so I'll probably just kind of touch on these a little bit more if that's acceptable to you. So paragraph 488 on page 147, the need to decarbonize in order to address the effects of climate change is well recognized and well evidenced, and it is also fully supported by Bowel. An important difference, however, between the parties at this inquiry is that whilst objectors seek to rely on airport capacity limits to meet climate change objectives, Bowel seeks to rely on aviation carbon limits to achieve the objectives. Bowel's approach is consistent with the government's message that it's not about stopping people doing things, it's about doing the same things differently. We will still fly on holiday, but in more efficient aircraft using sustainable fuel. And I go on to develop here the theme that obviously one of the features of this issue, as opposed to the other environmental topics, is that it's a global one. When one's looking at effects, normally for an environmental topic, one looks at the effects on a particular element of biodiversity or particular receptors for some particular type of impact, and that is the effect. Obviously, for a global issue such as climate change, there can't be any meaningful assessment of a global effect from an individual project. And so what we have ended up having to do, consistent, I have to say, with the EIA regulations, is looking at the quantum of emissions and contextualizing those within other metrics, whether it be a planning assumption or a carbon budget or other things. One's not actually looking at an effect, one's comparing the size of a particular emission against some other appropriate, quantified criterion. And paragraph 494, I come back to a theme that I've touched on before. Significantly, there is no dispute between Bowel and NSC, or indeed anyone else, about the calculation of the carbon impacts of the proposed development. Nor is there any dispute about the primary test to be applied when considering the significance of those emissions, The outstanding dispute concerns the application of that test, namely, whether the emissions from the proposed development are so significant as would materially impact the ability of the UK to meet its carbon budgets and targets. In respect of this issue, the dispute is fundamental. This is reflected in the way the parties have presented their evidence. Whilst NSC's approach is that we simply cannot answer this question without a national level of assessment of the impact of all airport transport and presumably all other development on the UK's ability to meet its climate change obligations, Bowel's approach has been to look at the legal and policy framework within which the UK government is operating and consider the scale of the emissions from the proposed development and whether this would have a material impact on the ability of the government to meet its climate change obligations in that context. What we've then done is set out the legal and policy context through the various international conventions and starting obviously with the Framework Convention from 1992 and then the various protocols and agreements under that. And I then get on page 151 to the national context. And again, I'll just pick up some paragraphs just to emphasize them. Paragraph 505. During the inquiry, NSC has sought to develop an argument that the legal duty to ensure that the net zero target by 2050 and 5-yearly carbon budgets means that, quote, a grant of planning permission would be contrary to the statutory, sorry, there's a typo there, to the statutory duties to ensure attainment contained in Section 1 and Section 4 of the Climate Change Act and therefore is unlawful. You might need to, I think it might have been late when I was typing this particular paragraph. This obviously is a quote from NSC's speaking note, and so I apologise to Mr. Taylor, I slightly mangled his words, but it's pretty much there. This is completely wrong. The Section 1 and 4 duty to ensure is a duty on the Secretary of State. It is not a duty on individual planning inspectors or local planning authorities determining planning applications up and down the country. The duties on the planning inspectors to determine applications derive from the Town and Country Planning Act, not the Climate Change Act. To conclude that if there is uncertainty whether a grant of planning permission would be consistent with the attainment of the 6 CB target of net zero by 2050, it cannot be rationally concluded that granting planning permission would ensure attainment of these targets and would therefore be unlawful, would bring the UK planning system to its knees, as no applicant for planning permission could demonstrate such a thing. This is not, however, what the law requires. The duty to ensure that the carbon budgets and targets are met lies with the Secretary of State. Planning inspectors should have regard to the carbon emissions of a development, as Bowel has made clear, but in the context of this inquiry should then apply the agreed test to determine the significance of such emissions within the context of the legal powers available to government at a national level. In this regard, it will be necessary for the inspectors to form a planning judgment in the context of the scale of those emissions, which is not challenged, but also recognizing that aviation, along with, for example, energy, falls within the traded sector. That is, its emissions are capped. For applications related to non-traded sectors, the considerations may be different, as they may have been for the inspectors dealing with the A38 Derby Junction DCO, but that's not the case here. So obviously, the inspectors with the A38 Derby Junction DCO were dealing with emissions from road traffic. That's not a capped sector. There's no cap on the emissions. You're dealing here with an application for a sector where emissions are controlled in a very different way. They're part of the traded sector. So I then go on to deal with things like the sixth carbon budget order on page 153 and 154, the greenhouse gas emission trading scheme. And I'll just pick up a couple of paragraphs there if that's okay. To deal, I think, really with a point that has been particularly a band CC point. So I'll just sort of introduce and explain the order. So this is the order that brought in the UK ETS. Since 2005, the UK has participated in the EU emission trading scheme, which has included the aviation sector since 2012. As part of the UK's withdrawal from the EU, the UK ETS has replaced the UK's participation in the EU ETS with the effect from the 1st of January this year. The UK ETS was established through the Greenhouse Gas Trading Scheme Order 2020. This trading scheme was established under Section 44 of the Climate Change Act. Section 2, Para 2 of the Climate Change Act requires any trading scheme to specify the period to which it relates, and the 2020 it should be, 2020 order relates to the period to 2030. Clearly, the CCA 2008 anticipates that further orders will be made in due course to reflect the Secretary of State's legal duties under Section 4 of the Act in order to meet the ongoing 5-yearly cycles of carbon budgets. Now, I then go on to explain some other things about the order, but I kind of return to the theme of paragraph 518, and it's just worth, I think, reflecting on this. As stated above, further orders may be made under Section 44 of the Climate Change Act, and the government has clearly stated its intention to consult on an appropriate trajectory for the UK ETS cap following the UK's sixth carbon budget report, with the aim of aligning the cap with the net zero trajectory to 2023. Footnote 55, explanatory memorandum to the Greenhouse Gas Emission Trading Order itself. In other words, in the very legislation that set the cap to 2030, it tells us in the explanatory memorandum, obviously, we will be consulting on what should be the appropriate cap for the period beyond 2030 in order to meet the sixth carbon budget. So this point that is made by BAN CC and others that somehow there's this just policy vacuum, for all these things, is just absolutely wrong. The government has set out very clearly what it proposes to do. And we make the point in the next paragraph that it is important to remember that the UK ETS is simply one of the mechanisms available to government. It can introduce whatever legislation it feels appropriate from time to time in order to meet its duty. I then go on from paragraph 520 onwards to look at CORSIA, in effect similar points on that. Clearly, as a scheme, it currently has a date, when it's running to, but this sort of concept that, from then on nothing will happen is just quite wrong. It's very clear that the international cooperation on things like CORSIA is intended to be long-term and consistent with duties under the international framework agreements. After all, ICAO is a UN body itself. We then look at the APF, MPU, MBU, AMPS, decarbonizing transport. Paragraph 5 to 9, we do there set out some of the themes that can be drawn from decarbonizing transport and the Jet Zero consultation, recognizing, of course, as we do, that the Jet Zero consultation is exactly that. It is a consultation, but also recognizing within the Jet Zero consultation that there are, my paragraph 530, there are certain things on which it is not consulting. It's not consulting on the AMPS, APF, and MBU. Statements about the status of those documents are therefore statements of government policy. We then set out from paragraph 161 a section on approach to assessment, and I'm going to read some of these sections. It is helpful first to, this is paragraph 535, it is helpful first to identify and debunk a number of fallacies that have been presented during the course of the inquiry. I identify them first. So the fallacy that Bowel relies on MBU as a basis for excluding the carbon emissions from the proposed development as a material consideration in the determination of this appeal. That's a fallacy. Secondly, the fallacy that consent cannot be granted for any airport development until the government has carried out an assessment of the carbon impact of all UK airport projects and determined whether any airport expansion is compatible with net zero, and if so, which. That's a fallacy. C, the fallacy that because the UK is currently assessed to be off track to meet its climate change targets, that it will not meet those budgets when they arise. This is again clearly a fallacy. So I won't read all of the sections on fallacy, but I'll touch on some. With regards to the first fallacy, at no point has it been Bowel's case that the carbon emissions from the proposed development are not a material consideration in the determination of the appeal. This is one of the few places where I actually directly quote from one of the other closings. There has been, therefore, no shift in approach as suggested by BAN CC. This is part of the fallacy. The simple fact is that Bowel's position has either been misunderstood or mischaracterized, but it has been clear and consistent throughout. Paragraph 538, I just touch on some of those figures that you will be familiar with about the scale of our emissions in the context of either A, the 37.5, the planning assumption, or the 23 megatons CO2, which is the CCC's balanced pathway assumption. One of the points made against us, well, you haven't assessed yourself against CCC and balanced pathway. We have actually. That's what the 23 megatons by 2050 was, and you can see again our contribution to that is a fraction of a percent. 540, it's quite clear, therefore, that Bowel does not suggest, and has never suggested, that the carbon emissions from the proposed development, including those from aviation, are not material to the determination of the appeal. Those emissions have been calculated, in respect of which there is agreement. No one has suggested we've got those numbers wrong, so far as I can recall, at least not any of the experts on this. And the significance of those considered in the context of the carbon budgets and the government's net zero target by the nature of the second test of significance, namely whether the emissions are so significant they would have a material impact on the ability of the government to meet its obligations. It is necessary to consider how the government will seek to meet those obligations and the impacts of the emissions on that ability. Bowel's reliance on MBU is twofold. First, it provides in-principle policy support for Bristol Airport making best use of its runway, subject to the resolution of environmental issues. And second, it identifies a distinction between issues that are within the remit of local policy and issues that are addressed by national policy. The prime example of matters to be dealt with at a national level are aircraft emissions of carbon. This does not, however, mean that aircraft emissions of carbon associated with the development are not material. They need to be taken into account, but within the context of the mechanisms to control them at a national level in order to meet carbon targets and budgets. So the second fallacy, NSC and BANCC have presented arguments that are in essence the same, namely that permission cannot be granted for this development or any airport development unless and until the UK government has identified in detail the trajectory to net zero, carried out an assessment of the total emissions of all proposed projects to identify whether any increase in airport capacity is compatible with that trajectory, and if so, assessed which airport project should be permitted. This second fallacy reflects in part NSC's and BANCC's position on cumulative effects, an issue that is covered later. There are 5 points to make in response. The implication of this approach is that the government's policy of making best use is rendered meaningless. MBU provides in-principle support for any airport outside Heathrow making best use of its existing runways subject to the resolution of environmental issues. If there can be no airport expansion until the government has carried out a central assessment of airport development projects and determined which of these comes forward, then the policy of making best use in the APF and MPU has no effect. The implication of this approach is that there is, at present, a moratorium on airport development. This would be distinctly at odds with the government's very recent reiteration of MBU as its current policy, which is to be given full effect in decision-making. Indeed, this approach finds no basis in any published policy or government statement. If the government considered it necessary to carry out an assessment of all airport development projects before any particular project could come forward, it would have said so. This is particularly so in the light of the recent publication of the Decarbonising Transport Strategy and the launch of the Jet Zero consultation and the publication of the accompanying evidence and analysis document. Indeed, the Jet Zero consultation document envisages that there will be growth in demand between 58 and 60% by 2050. These documents also make clear that the government does not envisage restricting airport capacity as a means of achieving net zero. This approach is also clearly inconsistent with the decision by government not to recover the jurisdiction in the present appeal. If the approach advocated by NSC and BANCC was correct, then it would be necessary to recover jurisdiction for this appeal and indeed all other airport planning applications to ensure that planning permission is not granted prematurely for any particular airport development. This approach is also not borne out by the approach adopted in other recent planning and appeal decisions relating to airport development. This includes the Stansted appeal decision, which too was not recovered or called in, which granted planning permission for the expansion of Stansted Airport in the absence of a central government assessment of the type suggested by NSC and BANCC. Taken to its logical conclusion, this reasoning, BANCC and NSC's reasoning, would be applicable to all forms of development and result in a blanket ban on granting permission for any development that could have a positive carbon impact, however small, until central government has identified the trajectory to net zero for the whole economy. Indeed, as the Bayes Energy Emissions Update demonstrates, within the non-traded sector, the major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is the residential sector. On this basis, NSC and BANCC's approach would mean that planning permission could not be granted for any residential development unless and until the government has identified how the residential sector will reach net zero by 2050 and ensure that any particular residential development is compatible with this. This is nonsense. Standing back, it is surprising that NSC has continued to pursue this line of argument. Dr. Hinnells expressly accepted that there is no moratorium on airport development, and accordingly no statement in government policy to that effect. Which brings me to the third fallacy. With regards to the third fallacy, both NSC and BANCC have sought to rely on the CCC's progress report to Parliament 2021 to demonstrate that the UK is not currently performing in line with the trajectory to net zero and the fourth and fifth carbon budgets. There is a legal duty on the Secretary of State to meet the fourth and fifth carbon budgets, and he has the ability to take measures to ensure that the UK does so. As Dr. Hinnells agrees, the inspectors should assume that the Secretary of State will comply with its legal duties and these carbon budgets will be met. Footnote reference is given to where he agreed that. Furthermore, being off track now in relation to a budget period that has not even started and in respect of which further legal and policy measures can be taken is, in reality, meaningless. The reason that BEIS and the CCC publishes future performance projections is exactly to allow the government to take the necessary measures to meet its legal obligations, to meet future budgets in a timely and efficient manner. Thus, being off track now against a future budget that does not apply for some years does not mean that the budget will not be complied with when it arises. Clearly, the government will not actually be on or off track to meet any particular budget until that budget period has ended, and those for the fourth, fifth, and sixth budgets have not even started. And then the correct approach. There are 4 preliminary points to make about the correct approach to assessing the impact of the proposed development in terms of carbon emissions and climate change as follows. It's not with respect for the inspectors in the context of a local planning inquiry to review the merits of government policy. The inspectors must have regard to and attach appropriate weight to current government policy. The question of weight is, of course, a matter for the inspectors. It is not for the inspectors to advise government on the formulation of new government policy, nor is it for the inspectors to make findings on the likely success or otherwise of advances in aircraft technology or greenhouse gas removals over the next 30 years. And when considering the carbon emissions from the proposed development, the source of emissions is relevant. The legal and policy framework for airline, i.e. aviation emissions, is distinct from the framework for emissions from ground and surface access emissions. This is partly the point about traded and non-traded sectors and ETS and so on. So I then set out our assessment in the ES and the ETS. We draw some conclusions there on significance. You can see in paragraph 558, the ESA has carried out 2 assessments of significance, the extent to which the scheme materially affects the ability to meet the aviation planning assumption, and then the extent to which the scheme materially impacts on the ability of the UK to meet its carbon budgets and target. And part of the reason that there are 2 is obviously, you know, originally when we were looking at this before there was a 6th carbon budget, we only had the planning assumption, because the planning assumption was relevant to the 4th and 5th budgets, and therefore that was the only way we could contextualize. What became apparent as time moved on following refusal and the emergence of the 6th carbon budget, in which there is no planning assumption, is that we needed to then look at it in that context, and that's how the second test, in a sense, looking at it in terms of the budgets became material. So we've done both of those. So you know, one might say that the planning assumption is actually still relevant to some extent at least, for the next two budgets, but there is none for the sixth carbon budget and thereafter, and so and so we then presented an alternative. And what we set out there is from paragraph 559, the assessment in relation to the first assessment of significance, and then from 561 onwards, an assessment that looks more generally, and Dr. Ireland's conclusion that in that context, the emissions from this development are not significant, they're not likely significant effects against the agreed policy test. Page 172, we set out there, paragraph 568, the principal or key points of agreement between Bowel and NSC. And there are actually a number of them, quite a considerable number. And then at 569, we've identified what we understand to be the principal issues that remain in dispute. And those are firstly whether MBU is out of date and should be afforded reduced weight, the continuing relevance of evaluating the significance of emissions against the planning assumption. I've just kind of touched on that a little bit. See whether weight can be placed on the UK ETS, and the need to carry out a cumulative assessment of all airport expansion projects. I'll just touch on the much vexed question of whether the MBU is out of date, just so that you have our position. The crux of NSC's case is the argument that MBU as a policy is out of date and should be accordingly given little weight, I quote. The basis on which it is argued that this is the case is that the position is now fundamentally different from the time when MBU was adopted. This is because MBU was adopted in a policy context without net zero and before the sixth carbon budget and the inclusion of international aviation within it. In this context, it is important to recognize that MBU itself always recognized that there remains uncertainty over future climate change policy and international arrangements to reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gases. It is, of course, axiomatic that circumstances will often change during the life of government policy, but in this case, there have been recent and frequent restatements of that policy as identified elsewhere in this closing. These statements have confirmed the government's clear policy position that MBU remains the most up-to-date policy and should be given full effect in decision-making. Extraordinarily, Dr. Hinnells seeks to argue that these statements do not mean that MBU is up to date, nor that it should be given full weight. I give the reference. Dr. Hinnells distinguishes between the policy that is the most up to date and a policy that is up to date. Whilst MBU is the most up to date, it is apparently still out of date. Furthermore, Dr. Hinnells argues that there is a distinction between full effect in decision making and full weight in decision making. Dr. Hinnells' interpretation of these statements strains the actual words used to breaking point and beyond. The government has made its position surely abundantly clear. MBU, including the support for airports making best use of their existing runways, is current, up-to-date policy that is to be given full effect in decision-making. If the government thought otherwise, it could have made that clear, or indeed revoked the policy. It's done neither. MBU remains a material consideration in the determination of the appeal, just as it was before the adoption of net zero or the sixth carbon budget, and it should be accorded full weight. In any event, Dr. Hinnells sought to clarify his position on MBU in cross-examination. He explained that whilst the words of MBU should be given full weight, The numbers could not. What Dr. Hinels means is that the analysis carried out in MBU as to the impact of airports making best use on achieving the UK's climate change targets was not carried out in the context of net zero and the sixth carbon budget. The response to this is twofold. A, as explained above, the government has restated MBU as a policy position since the adoption of net zero and the sixth carbon budget. It remains current government policy, notwithstanding the changes in the legal framework. More fundamentally, the fact that the mathematical analysis in MBU was carried out in a pre-net zero and pre-sixth carbon budget world only matters if one subscribes to the second fallacy identified above, namely that there must be a national level assessment of carbon impacts of all airport development projects in order to ensure it can come forwards compatibly with net zero. This provides the basis for NSC's argument that it would be premature to grant planning permission for any airport development in advance of such an assessment. For the reasons explained above, this approach results in a moratorium on airport development that Dr. Hinels accepts is not reflective of UK law or policy and deprives MBU of any effect. Indeed, it's apparent from Mr. Gertler's proof of evidence that the approach he adopted to MBU and indeed APF renders it entirely incapable of being a material consideration in the planning balance. As he explains, MBU does not provide any in-principle support per se for applications to increase the use of existing runways. MBU only provides weight in favour of a scheme once it is established that the benefits outweigh the costs. The implication of this approach is that where the planning balance indicates planning permission should be granted without taking into account MBU, MBU supports that outcome. Where it is determined that planning permission should not be granted, again without taking into account MBU, MBU is simply not engaged. On this basis, there is simply no way that MBU can ever be have a material impact on the outcome of the planning balance. If this approach were to be adopted by the inspectors, it would constitute a failure to take into account a material consideration. In cross-examination, even Mr. Gertler appeared to doubt his own approach. I'll then just turn to paragraph 580. The argument relating to the need for a cumulative assessment is closely allied to the second fallacy identified above, namely that planning permission cannot be granted for the proposed development in the absence of a government-led analysis of the extent of airport capacity compatible with the trajectory net zero in order to inform the government's selection of airport projects to come forward. There are three additional points to make in respect of this argument, and this is a cumulative argument. First, the assessment in the ESA, and the evidence of Dr. Osland has sought to contextualize the emissions from the proposed development against the planning assumption. It's also identified emissions from other known expansion projects and explain the effect of including aviation within the sixth carbon budget in the context of the UK ETS and CORSIA. Secondly, setting carbon budgets and the allocation of allowances under the UK ETS are, by their nature, cumulative exercises. They are set at a national level and apply equally to all airlines operating in the UK. In other words, if you have a system where all airlines have to have allocations, carbon allocations, in order to fly from whichever airport they would want to fly from within the UK, that is, by its very nature, cumulative. It's taken into account all airlines. Thirdly, whilst the EIA regulations require the cumulative assessment of the proposed development with other projects, this is limited to those that are consented and or approved, does not include any obligation to assess the cumulative impact of emissions on the global climate as a receptor, the point I made sort of at the start of this section. This is indicative of the fact that climate change is a matter of national and indeed international concern. There is no requirement for any further cumulative assessment, either in law or policy, of all known airport projects. non-CO2 impacts, I'll just pick up before moving on from climate change altogether, paragraph 582, because I think non-CO2 impacts in some respects is slightly sort of misunderstood. So I've set out in 581 a position there of what we do, but I've said this: the further difficulty with non-CO2 effects is that such effects are not within, sorry, that's again my typo, NDCs, nationally declared contributions, sorry, not within NDCs declared under the Paris Agreement or the UK's carbon budgets and its net zero target. In other words, non-CO2 effects can't simply be added to CO2 effects and then compared, for example, to the sixth carbon budget, because the sixth carbon budget was not set at a level that includes non-CO2. Furthermore, non-CO2 effects, such as contrails and cirrus clouds, are short-term effects, and in some cases just for a few hours, or in others a few days, and are reversible. To quantify such effects, therefore, risks producing a number, we identify a number, that is potentially misleading, as it cannot meaningfully be used in assessing the likely significant effects of the proposed development. And therefore, we as we explain our evidence, our position is, as we understand it, compliant with a policy in this particular regard. Chapter 9 starts on page 182, and again, I will probably deal with this in a fairly light touch way. We set out in the normal way our introduction, policy context. Page 184, we deal with the wider context and the history in this section of the Green Belt inset and what it contemplated when it was set. We set out our assessment of harm to openness, which I emphasize has always dealt with both physical, also known as spatial openness, and visual openness. It's quite wrong to characterize it as only having looked at one. You only have to read the documents to see that. From page 189, I touch on very special circumstances, and I think I can probably pass over that. We set out in paragraph 161 the three heads of the very special circumstances. And at page 194, paragraph 636, I set out the 10 matters of agreement falling into three broad categories, and I hope that's helpful in sort of identifying where there does seem to be common ground. And then over the page 195 and then 196, I set out the 6 broad issues that remain in dispute, and those are the baseline contribution of this area of the Greenbelt to Greenbelt purposes, the extent to which the proposed development in the Greenbelt is inappropriate. And this is to argue about the fillets along the side of the taxiway and the A38 works, the extent of harm to openness resulting from the proposed car park development, demonstration of very special circumstances, the weight to be given to the harm to openness, and the extent to which the proposed monitor and manage condition undermines the demonstration of very special circumstances. And each of those is then dealt with in turn. I don't think I really need to deal with any of those, and I'm also conscious of the passing of time. So I'll go to the end of that. On page 211, we come to a section which is called Other Matters. This is chapter 10. And it focuses on two other matters where there's been some form of substantial challenge. The first of those is landscape and visual impact, and this particularly relates to the evidence of Ms. Tudor on behalf of XR elders. And the second is the ecological impact of the proposed development. This was identified by PCAA. They haven't produced expert evidence on this issue, but they have put in a legal submission, and we respond specifically from page 215 to that, but it's also touched on in terms of some of the legal points in the Appendix A legal appendix. And that's one of those examples where actually some of the points we've put in the legal appendix because they seem most appropriate, but we try and sort of draw general attention here, and you can see at 174 a reference to the appendix. So planning balance starts at page 218, and it starts by setting out on that page the broad legal and policy framework, and we have tried to help you by very clearly framing our submissions and the legal balance within what I suggest is the correct approach in section 38(6), and we've structured this section, which we'll come to in a minute, by reference to the reasons for refusal. We've set out first, unusually here, normally we set out a number of things first, and then and our assessment, and then get to areas of dispute and areas of agreement towards the end of a chapter. Here we've quite deliberately stood it on its head, and the reason for that is that you can then see, look, what's agreed, what's in dispute, and then at the end you get our planning balance. So that's the reason for that. 272 sets out, what are really quite a substantial, and covering, more than 2 pages of bullet points of things that we understand that are agreed. 278, the overarching point of disagreement between the two principal parties, unsurprisingly, is the extent to which the proposed development complies with the development plan and the role of material considerations. There are 5 issues in particular that are in dispute of the policy context that informs this overall position, and those are the nature of the support provided by MBU for making best use of existing runways and the role of this within the planning balance. Secondly, the weight to be given to MBU, so there's the way you use it, but then also the weight to be attached to it. The meaning of the levelling up agenda, the way in which the balancing of benefits and effects must be carried out with regard to local communities. This is the point about, well, look, hang on, you've got to share the benefits between this community, and it's the same people in effect, or the same community must share both benefits and effects. And E, the policy approach to be applied in assessing the residual environmental effects of the proposed development. And what then happens is we set out our submissions on each of those things. I think I can pass over those. These are important points. If I had more time, I would probably have read the section from page 225 on balancing of benefits and effects, but I don't, so I'm going to be reasonably strict with myself. But that is quite an important section because it goes to the heart of what seems to be now quite an important point in the Council's in the Council's case. And page 228, satisfactory resolution of environmental issues. Again, we try to deal with that in the context of setting what we say is the proper policy approach for the way you look at these things. 229 sets out again the position of officers, and from 230 we have our planning balance. And as you can see here, what we've done, in paragraph 261, section 8 of the proof of evidence of Mr. Melling contains a detailed analysis of the planning balance. The structure of the assessment is as follows. First, a consideration of the extent to which the proposed development complies with policies of the development plan. This is structured around NSC's reasons for refusal and the policies cited therein, but also reflects the other issues raised by Rule 6 parties that are not part of the reasons for refusal, and indeed some of the points raised by NSC themselves that are not part of the reasons for refusal. So we try to cover those things, but in the context of reasons for refusal. Secondly, a consideration of the other material considerations. This includes the consistency of the proposed development plan with the development with the MPPF and national aviation policy, and the need for and benefits of increasing capacity. So we carry out that assessment, and you can see that starts with, on page 231, whether we're in accordance with the development plan. And that section concludes on page 237, paragraph 7, 8, 9, where we say, on the basis of the reasoning already set out, Mr. Melling concludes that the proposed development accords with the development plan taken as a whole. The proposed development should therefore be approved unless other material considerations indicate otherwise. And of course, in that balance of other material considerations, if you did, for whatever reason, come to the conclusion that there was non-compliance with policy, again, you'd still have to go on to the other material considerations to see if they outweighed non-compliance with the policy. That's the whole point of the test. We say we do comply with policy, and therefore the other material considerations add to the Section 38(6) presumption, but obviously we have to cover all the issues. So the other material considerations, we've set out an assessment against the MPPF, and in particular economic, social, environmental objectives of the MPPF, and we say that we do meet them. We've set out assessment against national aviation policy, and we've also looked at the needs for and the benefits of the proposed development. And as part of national aviation policy, we've included the APF and MBU, in other words, that making best use of existing runways and meeting the demands of people to fly does get in principle support, subject obviously to other issues having been resolved, but there is that in principle support. It is a good thing in terms of government policy, if I can rather kind of crudely and perhaps not accurately summarize it in that way. Need for and benefits are therefore looked at. Residual environmental effects are also taken into account. And then we come to the overall conclusion. So paragraph 802, as Mr. Melling explains, the proposed development complies with the development plan, national aviation policy, and the NPPF. There are no material considerations that indicate permission should be refused. The adverse environmental effects are modest, and Bowel has proposed a substantial package of mitigation measures which exceed that required by policy. In the light of the limited degree of harm, any residual adverse effects should be ascribed limited weight. Balanced against this are the substantial socio-economic benefits that would be delivered by increasing the capacity of the airport to accommodate 12 Mppa. These translate into real-world benefits for real people, opportunities for skills, training, jobs, the chance to travel, improved public transport provision, increased economic activity in the local area, and further investment in the place they live and work. These benefits reflect key government objectives for levelling up the regions, building back better, strengthening the vital connectivity provided by airports, and supporting the role of airports as engines for economic growth. The government's position remains that it supports the making best use of existing airport capacity. The proposed development does just this. On balance, therefore, it's Bowel's case that this appeal should be allowed and planning permission granted for the proposed development. And so I will not take you through it, but you should have, each with a separate cover sheet, 2 appendices, and Appendix 1, which is Bowel's response to legal submissions raised by other parties, which is deals with the submissions really from the Council, PCAA and BAN-CC, and is divided down into the 5 sections on a thematic basis that I identified at the beginning of these closing submissions. And I hope that is clear. And then these sections are not now consecutively numbered because they're separate appendices, but there is, after the end of that document, which is at page 13, after page 13 there's then an Appendix 2 cover sheet. And Appendix 2 is the Unilateral Undertaking accompanying the South Bristol Airport Mppa appeal commentary. It's a commentary on how the 106 will work with the existing 106. It talks about the unilateral undertaking, the justification for the replacement of the airport service access strategy and associated public transport mode share obligation, justification for the flyer shuttle funding obligation, justification for the parking phasing obligation, justification for the night noise mitigation scheme obligation, and so on. I mean, you will look at the idea of that is so that you have in effect our closing submissions on the way that those documents work, and we just hope that that is useful to you, and we obviously, along with the council, very conscious that you don't have quite the final version of the 106. It's only this one schedule, but that will be sorted. So. So I suppose at the end of 9 weeks of sitting here, I think I've been in this room every single one of the 36 days bar 1.5. I don't hold the record. I think the technicians have outperformed me, but I'm up there with them, I think. So at the end of there's those that is our closing submissions. It perhaps only remains for me, I hope on behalf of all of us, just to thank the 3 of you, but also the program officer. I would like to thank the technicians and others who have actually made this run extremely smoothly. And as I say, I say that I hope on behalf of all of us. Genuinely, it's been a long inquiry, and we're very grateful to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Humphreys, and indeed Ms. Noble for that. Just I think a few words before we close from us, or from me to start with. I mean, I took this appeal on in a fit of enthusiasm at the end of last year, I knew it was going to be a big and complicated case, and I knew that there were going to be strong feelings aroused. I didn't then appreciate quite how large and quite how complex. Whether I would have taken it on if I'd known that, we'll never know. Also, going back to that time, we were in the depths of the pandemic, and it was never clear whether this was going to be a predominantly physical inquiry, as we always wanted, and the extent to which it was going to be a blended event. And I mean, we went back to the test event in, when was it? It was June, it seems a long time ago, but the CMC and the test event in June. And even before that, we weren't sure how the technology was going to work, but echoing what you said, Mr. Humphreys, it has been seamless. This has definitely been the biggest blended event that PINS has been involved with, and the technology has been amazing. We've had scarcely a hiccup, and we have fed that back internally within PINS as an exemplar of how you can do events like this. I mean, one of the initial things that I did, good move on my part, was to make sure that I had two colleagues up here with me. It's the first time that I've done a Section 78 panel inquiry. I couldn't have done this inquiry without them, and I would ask them both please not to disappear over the next few weeks, because we have got just a little bit of work to do. But as I say, it has worked as a panel. We are still, I think, speaking. I also don't underestimate the challenges of the pandemic. And of course, when all this was being set up, we were in the depths of the pandemic. And we are really grateful for the council for organising the venue, keeping us all as safe as possibly could. And again, in that respect, it has worked. Now, I know a lot of people who've been involved in this aren't here either in the room or even virtually, but I would actually genuinely like to thank all parties to the inquiry. I've said this before at other inquiries, but I really do mean it on this one. The Appellant, the council, the Rule 6, and all the individuals who've turned up, I thought that with the number of parties involved and the number of unrepresented parties, this was going to be a really hard inquiry to go through, just because of the sheer scale of the contributions and the variety of the issues. It hasn't been. I'm not saying it's an easy inquiry to write up, quite the reverse, trust me, but it hasn't been as difficult an inquiry to run as I thought it would be. I mean, the timetabling has always been a challenge, but with everybody else's help, Joanna sitting at the back there has actually kept us on time. And how on earth we did it, we're actually finishing on the day we said we'd finish. I never thought we'd do that. I mean, we've got a huge range of core documents, and I think we've just tipped over the 100 inquiry documents submitted during the course of the inquiry. And that'll keep us busy over the next little while. But genuinely, all the parties have put their cases very clearly, very powerfully, very positively, and as you would expect, everybody has been trying to persuade us naturally to reach the approach that they would like us, the decision that they'd like us to reach. But it all has been put in an incredibly helpful way, and it's made it a lot easier for us getting through these X number of weeks. You'll notice I long since stopped saying this is day whatever it is. I lost the plot on that ages ago. The only other thing I'd like to say, quite genuinely, because it's been such an unusual event for, I think, everybody and for the inspectorate, if anybody quite neutrally wants to feed back to the inspectorate, I think not through Joanna, but direct to the PINS case officer, excuse me, back to the PINS case officer, Leanne Palmer. Any thoughts, critical or otherwise, I mean, we're not going to see these, but any thoughts on how the event has gone, things that have worked, things that haven't worked? It would genuinely be useful, because we at PINS don't know where we're going in terms of physical or blended events. This has been a big beast, and it would actually help if a few lines go back into Leanne that can then be talked about around the inspectorate. And we won't see them, but even if we did, we've got broad shoulders. So that would genuinely be helpful. Claire. Oh, Mr. Morehouse, sorry, I saw you were there, but I didn't see your hand up.
My apologies, sir, for intervening at this stage. my learned friend Mr. Humphrey's closing submissions have made some references to the PCAA legal submissions on the Habitats Directive. We set out our position in the statement of case right at the beginning, and it hasn't altered in any way at all. And we submitted legal submissions in accordance with the directions that were given. The airport has chosen to, in fact, we deliberately submitted ours in advance of the closing date to give people a weekend to respond, although our position had been set out before. The airport has chosen to respond to those submissions in its closing submissions, and I would like to have the position to provide what would normally be a response to that. I don't anticipate from the work that I've been able to do this morning that it'll take more than one side of A4, because there are some fairly serious legal errors, I think, contained within those submissions, and I think that you as inspectors ought to be live to those when determining the issue. Fundamental to it is an assertion, for example, that an Article 6.3 determination, which you as inspectors have to reach, is entitled to take into account the compensatory land. And I think it's been dealt with, it's been suggested that can be dealt with by way of evidence, and it's clearly a matter of law. And I hope to explain why that is as part of that one-page document. But we think that we ought to be effectively afforded, given that we've set our stall all the way through and we now have only just had the response, an opportunity to comment on that.
Mr. Humphreys, your view on that?
I think Mr. Morehouse might want to read the submissions again. We haven't disagreed with his legal submissions. What we've said is that on the facts, the expert evidence, that this is mitigation, not compensation. Unless somewhere deep within here there's a typo, you know, I don't think there can be any other conclusion on that. I'm genuinely sort of slightly surprised at the point being made here. I mean, this is this section in our legal response on, you know, paragraphs 4 and so on. I'm just going through it.
Can I assist? I think if you look at paragraph 715 of the submissions and the suggestion that the matter can be dealt with by way of that this is a matter of evidence rather than a matter of law, and we have proceeded throughout this inquiry on the basis that these would be dealt with as legal submissions.
Well, 715 says, as explained below, the view reached by Bowel's expert ecologist is clear. The proposed replacement foraging land, which will be in place and mature prior to any works commencing on Cog Loop 2, meet the legal test for mitigation. This was the position agreed by NSC officers and Natural England, the expert body responsible for the natural environment, including ecology and biodiversity. There is no expert legal evidence before the inquiry that supports an alternative conclusion. And then when you look at the legal submissions, we point to the Briel's case and the Grace case, which Mr. Morehouse referred to, and we point out, as his own submissions pointed out, that these concern development on land within the European site. We draw attention to his case, Smythe and the approach to mitigation and compensation and the two different categories, while Smythe concerned development proposal not within a European site, in that instance the court dismissed the challenge. You just read the judgment, that's not disagreeing with it. What Bowel proposes in respect of replacement foraging land is explained in Appendix B to Mr. Melling's evidence. As explained, the foraging land will be provided prior to commencement of the works, as secured by the biodiversity management plan. The provision of replacement land is clearly designed to eliminate or reduce the effect of the SAC on the SAC bats and thus avoid any impact on the integrity of SAC. In accordance with the case law, Mr. Moorhouse's own case law, the replacement land is therefore mitigation. In this regard, PCAA are quite correct to point out that Bowel has not advanced an IROPI case. This is not, as PCAA suggests, because Bowel considers it outside the requirements of best practice, because it is a commercial planning application, but because the conclusion reached by Bowel's ecologist is clear: the replacement foraging land is mitigation. That land can be and was taken into account by Bowel in accordance with CJEU case law in assessing whether or not there would be an adverse effect on the integrity through appropriate assessment. The conclusion reached was there would be no adverse effect on integrity. This conclusion was reached by Bowel's professional ecologist and is supported by both Natural England and NSC. NSC did not consider that it gave rise to a reason for refusal. There has been no expert evidence called before the inquiry to contradict this conclusion, which is based on the professional judgment and is wholly consistent with CJEU case law. For the reasons given, the PCAA legal submissions are completely misconceived. I don't see how that is even vaguely suggesting that this is compensation and that we don't need to carry out an assessment.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we have slight difficulty in that we've naturally not had the chance to go through Appendix 1, isn't it?
Yes.
But we've got the original submissions from Mr. Moorhouse. We've got the case law. We've got the response, which obviously I haven't yet had the chance to read, from BAL. I think we're there. Now, I'm not saying where we're going to go with it, but the point has been put, the point has been responded. The fact that the point has been responded to today in closing is not unexpected. I can't see any prejudice to any party.
Well, may I just make two observations on that? One is at the beginning of the case, we provided a reference to the case of Orleans and the judgment in that. That is very clear. That is a case which makes an assessment of Briel's and all of the other cases that have gone before it. And that makes it very clear about the stage at which the inspectors are entitled to consider compensatory material, whether or not at the 6.3 stage that is permissible in law. So that's set out in our original position. But one matter which there has been a movement from the airport in their submissions is on the question of off-site, whether there is an impact, a difference between the impact on an SAC where the harm is caused off-site and on-site. And their position evidentially prior to these closing submissions appears to have been that it makes no difference, that if there is harm to the foraging habitat, that would have a likely significant effect on the features of the SAC, in this case the bats, that it doesn't matter whether it's on or off-site. And there is legal authority on that as well. But if you don't need to be assisted in relation to those 2 points with any further note, then I will leave it here for now. But I would like it on the record that I've tried to raise these issues because we think they're important matters of law that you ought to be taking into account in the consideration, and clearly will have to in making a decision as to whether or not you are entitled to reach an Article 6.3 determination, and what you take into account when you do.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Morehouse. What we'll obviously do is naturally reread the initial submissions, reread this response, and all I can say is that if we are in any doubt as to where we sit at the end of that, although we're about to close the inquiry, we would come back to the parties, but we'll read what we've got and take it on from there. Okay, thanks, Mr. Morehouse. Oh, hello.
So, just one or two matters from me, if I may.
Yeah.
One is indeed to echo the thanks that Mr. Humphreys gave to the panel, indeed to the technicians, and indeed to everybody in the room for making this inquiry what it has been, which has been a pleasure to be a part of. The second point is that we haven't provided you with the case law yet that we referred to in our closing submissions, and I don't know whether that is something we could provide to you via the case officer early next week. Yeah. If we write in the usual way saying that you've requested it, and then we can...
Yes, I mean, I'm conscious that you've obviously referred to a number of items of case law, some of which I know, some of which I don't, but yeah, just as a matter of fact, if you could get that in next week, that would be most useful.
Thank you.
I just wonder, would it be sensible on that, and maybe it can be done through the council? I mean, it makes perfect sense because we're just talking about a file that has... I guess, would it be sensible to do that for all of the cases? Because BANCC have mentioned one or two, ones like Bushel have been mentioned. Could we take that offline? It seems logical that if you, and very sensible suggestion, if I may say so, to have...
I think we would be happy to sort of be the centre for collation of other people's cases.
That's what
they send them to us.
I think that might be helpful.
And then we'll do it in one hit.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Then you can have one file.
Yeah, have a discussion on that, but I think that would help. Thank you.
Okay, just to continue with the closing comments from us. I wholeheartedly, and I'm sure Mr. Young does agree with everything Mr. Ware has said. We've got some specific people to thank from us all, but I'm sure everyone in the room shares that as well. So IT, Mike and Richard, and plus others in the corner who've been very patiently sat there listening, probably wondering what on earth it is we all do and why we do this. But I think none of this would have worked. I think, it was in their gift. So we really are appreciative. To the security as well. So there's Nigel outside. I think he's had some busier days than others. I think today's been a bit busy as well. But and there have been other security people as well. Thank you to Natalie Richards as well for support. And then other supporting staff, Karen Lane, Janet Stevenson, Karen Owen, Rob Morgan, and anyone else I've missed or pronounced the name wrong. A huge thank you to Joanna Vincent, the Programme Officer, gone way beyond the call of duty many times, including lending me clothes when I was very cold in here. So.
I would say she never lent me any clothes.
And thank you to Weston-super-Mare for having us. We've had... really enjoyed the experience. The sunsets, trying out many of the restaurants and bars. This was yesterday. We had an afternoon sightseeing because when we came in June, we had all these plans to sightsee, but obviously we've been very busy, so we did have a nice afternoon last night and an evening. So we thought we'd just share that one with you. Obviously, we are back next week for the CPO, but in terms of the Section 78, it's been good.
I never thought I'd say this, but here you go. The inquiry is now closed. Thank you, genuinely, all of you. Thank you. I'd completely forgotten that photo that you were going to put up.